And we're live.
First of all, welcome you all to the Center of Asian Legal Studies at the University of São Paulo event of this evening in Canada this afternoon. We had the privilege today of receiving Professors Wei Kui. Professor Wei Kui is a professor at Peter A. O'Lara School of Law at the University of British Columbia, Canada. He has a Bachelor of Arts at Harvard College in the US, Master of Arts in Philosophy at Tufts University, Juris Doctor at Yale Law School, Master of Laws in Tax Law at New York University, School of Law, and also Professor Wei Kui is member of the Center of Asian Legal Studies at the University of British Columbia. Professor Wei Kui will talk to us about the administrative foundations of the Chinese fiscal state. And after his presentation, we'll have some comments by Professor Luiz Eduardo Chueri from the University of São Paulo. Professor Chueri is Bachelor of Business Management from Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, Bachelor of Laws, PhD in Livre Docente at the University of São Paulo, School of Law. He holds a master's degree of laws at the University of Munich, and also he's a full professor or professor titular at the Department of Financial, Economic, and Tax Law at the University of São Paulo School of Law. First, we have the introductory presentation by Brother Wei Kui, and after we have the comments by Professor Luiz Eduardo Chueri. Professor Wei Kui, you have our attention.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you today. As I mentioned before, I visited USP Law School over 10 years ago. I fondly remember visiting the building and then taking a walk around the center of São Paulo on that trip. It was a very momentary contact in my academic career. I'm glad that we're back in touch. So I think of the audience today as potentially of two varieties. One is law students and law professors who might be interested in Chinese law. And that's because the invitation comes from SILA. The other audience may be students and scholars who know something about tax law and drawn to this event because of Professor Chueri's reputation. So I'm going to try to give a talk addressed to this audience, not too technical. And my aim in the presentation is to follow three guiding questions addressing an audience that seems far away, and especially far away from China. The three guiding questions correspond to three planned parts of my talk. I will talk about first, why might Brazilians, or Canadians, or Americans for that matter, want to know something about Chinese taxation? That, after all, is the focus of my talk today. But second, I would also talk about what can one learn about Chinese law by studying Chinese taxations. I want to say that I have messages that are central to the study of Chinese law and not just Chinese taxation. And then finally, I'm going to tie this together and explain why, what does the Chinese case show about the relationship between law and taxation, and how does this relationship matter to the rest of the world? The third part is going to be the most academic, and it draws on a book that will be published in just a few months' time by Cambridge University Press called The Administrative Foundation of the Chinese Fiscal State. And that is also the title of today's talk. So let me start with the first motivating question. What might you want to know something about Chinese taxation? And I'm going to pick a very recent set of events to motivate this question. Is there a common prosperity campaign in China? So reading newspapers, I'm not sure how much this is in the Brazilian press, but since November 2020, the Chinese government has taken dramatic regulatory actions against Chinese big tech companies. And it started with a very breathtaking action at the beginning of November 2020, when the government halted the IPO of Ant Financial, which is the financial arm of Alibaba. It took a few months for people to digest this, but the government proceeded to take regulatory actions against other companies as well. And so, again, very strikingly, in the past summer, Didi Chuxing, the Chinese Uber, had a US IPO. And before the US IPO, the government threatened the investigation of the company. The company disclosed this investigation, but people had a hard time telling how serious this problem was going to be. And the investigation of Didi IPO, of Didi Chuxing, took effect 2 days after the IPO, leading to a large share value drop. More recently, Chinese regulators have taken other actions against other companies that are listed, especially on the US exchanges. So this includes after-school tutoring, limiting tutoring curriculum that can be offered, restrictions on hours of online gaming that can be offered to Chinese consumers, and Tencent is the other big US Chinese company that's affected. And then more recently, in August, crackdowns on social media stars. So that involves some tax investigations, but it also involves restrictions on what they can do online. Again, I'm very curious whether this news has made it to Brazil. In the US, there is a strong reaction because it affects the stock market quite a bit. And so if you go to the Wall Street Journal, here are just some examples of a deluge of reporting. Here are some titles. Xi Jinping aims to rein in Chinese capitalism. Investors are trying to decode China's new populism. China's regulatory storm risks triggering wider economic damage. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, wrote an op-ed called "What Explains Xi's Pivot to the State." The Washington Post, a very different newspaper from Wall Street Journal, had articles titled "Why China's Been Changing Its Mind About Billionaires. Xi Jinping's Crackdown on Everything That is Remaking Chinese Society." And in the investment pages, be careful whose China investment advice you take. Same goes for New York Times, warning of income gap. Xi tells China's tycoons to share wealth. The Economist had essays about the vanishing allure of doing business in China. Xi Jinping's talk of common prosperity spooks the prosperous. And LA Times interviewed very good experts about whether China is serious about addressing economic inequality, but the lead-in is China is purging celebrities and tech billionaires. So the question then is are the press in the United States onto something? Is there a common prosperity campaign? So I use this to motivate some interest in Chinese taxation. I want to show you a couple of graphs, and you can decide for yourself whether there is a common prosperity campaign. So this is very simple, basic tax. You don't need to know any tax law to have some intuitions about this. So this graph graphs the evolution of what's called the gross tax ratio, which is simply the total tax revenue collected in the country relative to the GDP of that country. Okay, and so Brazil is quite famous for having a very high gross tax ratio. I'm sure that would come up in our discussion. What this picture does is to graph the entire evolution from 1985 until 2019. And basically, China started with a relatively high gross tax ratio. That was when China still had largely a command economy. And as the country moved to a market economy, there was a period when tax revenue really plunged. This happened in the mid-1990s. From then, it successfully and very quickly climbed back up so that by 2005, the gross tax ratio is about 18%. And in 2007, 2006, 2007, it went over 20%. Okay, so there's some ups and downs. But what you see is that there's a period of growth and there's a period of decline at the beginning. And then at the end, there's a period of stagnation. If you look at the years between 2012 and 2019, you see this is a period of stagnation. Okay, and so if there was a rise in taxation, that rise stopped around 2012. Now that is exactly the start of Xi Jinping's leadership in China. Okay, so the second graph I want to show is about the China's personal income tax revenue. This is an important tax revenue for a lot of countries, especially developed countries. I think it plays an important role in Brazil as well, right? Even though maybe it's not dominant the way it is in the United States. But this graphs the evolution of the personal income tax revenue to total tax revenue. So how important is the personal income tax? One of the most redistributive taxes that we know that's used across the country. That is going to be the solid line. And then the dotted line is going to be PIT revenue relative to GDP. And what you see is starting from 1990, going to 1998, there's a gradual rise. And then there was a rapid rise in the importance of the personal income tax up until about 2005. Okay. And then the importance of the PIT stagnated, especially relative to other tax revenue. So other tax revenue was growing a lot, but the PIT was not growing nearly as much, so that its share of total revenue was dropping. Let's look at what happened during the Xi Jinping era, starting from 2012. So there was a major tax cut for the personal income tax in 2011. That was 1 year before Xi Jinping took over. And so there, you saw this drop in tax revenue. And then nothing happened to the law. As a result, PIT revenue rose at a good speed, a bit similar to the early 2000s. But then it dropped to after 2008. And so that any kind of gain during the 2012 to 2018 period is wiped out. Okay. So from this, you can see, if we think about the personal income tax as a symbol of redistribution, Xi Jinping is ending at the same place where China started. Okay. And that's in contrast to earlier eras. So what lies behind these patterns is that Xi Jinping actually oversaw the most sustained and largest of tax cuts in China since 1994. Many delivered outsized benefits to the urban affluent. To give you a couple of examples, this is going to make the relatively affluent of us around the world, it may trigger some envy. And so after the personal income tax cut in 2018, you can be in the top 1% of income earners in China and still face a 10% marginal tax rate. Your average tax rate is minimal, probably 2%. Under the personal income tax, you can claim deductions for home mortgage interest expenses, children's education, including sending your kids abroad. You can claim deductions for supporting parents. If you're a business owner, since 2019, if you earn profit of less than 3 million Chinese yuan a year, your corporate income tax rate is only 10%. And so that's substantially lower even than the personal income tax rate. So we tax professors teach all around the world that if the corporate tax rate is much lower than the personal income tax rate, taxpayers are going to start earning income through corporations. And that is likely to be happening at a large scale in China, especially given that for those who earn less than 1 million of profit, the corporate tax rate is 5%. That's a very enviable, a low tax rate. There's no property tax on residences. And so some foreign reporting describing Chinese tax policy, saying that maybe Xi Jinping wants to finally push forward the property tax where there hasn't been, and that would help address inequality. Actually, the affluent shouldn't worry too much because all proposed property tax proposals would exempt primary residences from property taxation, which by North American and European standards is very unusual, right? All homeowners pay primary property tax on residence. Okay, so all this is to show that so in fact, this is what she has done. There's currently no plan to reverse the revenue losses from these major tax cuts. And therefore, the Chinese government is actually ill-positioned to spend more money on the poor and the middle class. Recent commentaries on common prosperity campaigns seem to be completely detached from China's fiscal reality. In fact, it's more striking than that. Imagine that, everyone knows, so if you study the US, Trump enacted very big tax cuts in 2017, right? And now Biden is calling for raising taxes back up again. Imagine the Trump tax cuts going completely unmentioned by the press. No one hears about it. And then when Biden tries to raise some taxes, everyone's talking about it. And people are putting out headlines like what we had before. Biden's a populist. Biden wants to tax the rich. There's a risk to the US economy and so on. But that essentially has happened in discussions about tax policy in China. So what's the takeaway from this? Redistribution through taxation and spending is among the most politically contested topics in China as it is elsewhere. Inequality in China is a big story, just like it is in the US. We are seeing two of the biggest economies in the world and among the most unequal. However, there's far less discussion of inequality in China, and it takes these really outlandish regulatory crackdowns on tech companies for the press to be talking about this at all. Why is that? And also, the Western press does talk about dealing with inequality being critical to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy and political stability in China. That should be, for adults thinking about society, that goes without saying. So why is it surprising to people that there's some concern about inequality, and why is it that all of the policies that aggravate inequality go unmentioned? The reason, this is something that I discuss a little bit in my book, is that information about this topic has tended to come from two highly unreliable sources. If you want to find out about Chinese tax policy, there are two sources. One is the Communist Party itself and its propaganda machinery. And then you have the rich talking about what's proper taxation. So we need to have better sources, more accurate understanding of Chinese tax policy to understand the policies addressing inequality in China, which is one of the biggest stories in the world economy right now. So I will come back to that, but for now, I'm going to move to the second part and take a detour and talk to those of you who are especially interested in Chinese law about what the book has to say about Chinese law. What do we learn about Chinese law through the story of Chinese taxation? And the title for this part is State Ordering Without Law. So my book is partly about Chinese law, but it's I can say that it's unlike any other book about Chinese law. There's a basic reason. What defines the rule of law in a country? There are basically two fundamentally different ways of thinking about law. The conventional way of thinking about law is to think about it as legal institutions. And so that includes legislatures, includes courts, maybe includes the legal profession. And so there are distinct institutions and social rules that are defined associated with law. I call that the superstructure of law. Underlying the superstructure is a type of human behavior that others have thought is crucial for the definition of law. So legal philosophers have pointed out that law essentially at the bottom is not about courts of a particular type or legislatures of a particular type. It's about the governance of rules. And so this idea goes back to H.L.A. Hart, goes to Longfellow, and there are contemporary legal theorists. I list Gillian Hatfield at the University of Toronto, Barry Weingast at Stanford, who write about the micro foundation of the rule of law. It's a kind of distinct human behavior. So there is academic theory about this, but I think the idea of the governance of rules as opposed to the governance of individuals is very intuitive to a lot of us. So what's the problem? The problem with studying Chinese law is that China has the former but lacks the latter. So instead of the governance of rules, you have personalized state authority, which is governance not of rules, but of men substituting for law and securing social order. Now, most studies of Chinese law study the superstructure of law, the legal superstructure, legal institutions, without asking the question whether that structure is supported by a foundation of behavior. And as a result of that, a lot of the assessment is inaccurate. Especially in North America and advanced economies, in Chinese law scholarship, there has been a discussion for about 20 years about whether China has rule by law, but not rule of law. But what I argue is that there's not even rule by law in China. There's no governance of rules, and therefore they cannot be rule of law. So that's a broad hypothesis. Let me make it more concrete. So in the book, I argue, if you follow the reasoning below, you get to see that legislators do not matter and courts do not matter. Okay. Here's the reason. Here is a very simple line of reasoning talking about why legislatures are superfluous. So China has a parliamentary system. The same political party, which is the Chinese Communist Party, controls both the legislative and executive branches. And that's the same as when you have a parliamentary democracy and the majority party controls both the executive and parliamentary branches. Okay. This structure is replicated from the national to the provincial to the prefectural and city levels. And because the same political actors control both the executive and the parliamentary branch, they have three choices for implementing policy. The first one is the enactment of statutes. And so 法律 or 法规 are the names for statutes. They're enacted by legislatures. Statutes involve the most procedures in terms of enactment. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily political contest. And so very often you hear about Chinese legislatures being criticized as rubber stamping parliaments. But rubber stamping is something that happens in every parliamentary system when the same party controls the executive and parliamentary branch. So there's not necessarily political contest, but there's a lot of procedure. Legislation involves a lot of publicity and also impact the legal mechanism. So courts treat statutes differently from other documents. There's formal regulations, in Chinese it's guizhang, that's adopted by the executive branch. It still follows a certain amount of procedure. There's a good amount of publicity, and so you can always find guizhang. Whatever guizhang you need, you can find it. And also it has an impact on the legal machinery. Finally, there's something called informal policy documents, 规范性文件. There's little procedure for their adoption, there's little publicity, and they don't rely on the legal machinery to be enforced. Okay, so I don't know if any of you studying Chinese law have come across this distinction. The basic story is that Chinese politicians overwhelmingly choose informal policy documents in tax and many other policy areas. Okay, so statutes and regulations are simply not used. So I show, here's a couple of slides. They're from papers, they're not in the book. But here, this depicts national agencies. Altogether, there are about 50 of them. And here's the ratio of formal regulations to informal policy documents. And so if you start from the right side, it's approaching zero, meaning that relative to informal policy documents, there's a minuscule amount of formal regulation. Okay. In fact, this line is going to be sort of the cap to that ratio, because a lot of informal documents, you can't find them. And so the real number for the denominator is very large. Even given what we find, you see that most policy directives are issued through informal policy documents. And here's taxation. Tax agencies is one branch that uses formal regulations the least. On the right hand, I have the same breakdown of formal regulation statutes and formal policy documents. And this is the red dots represent Chinese provinces. There are 31 of them. And the blue dot are Chinese cities, 49 Chinese cities that before 2015 had legislative capacity. And so instead of explaining the calculation, I just show that this vertical line here to the left is mostly informal policy documents, and to the right is statutes. Okay. And this horizontal line above this is formal regulations, and below this is informal policy documents. And so you see that in the tax and public finance area, very little happens on the right-hand side of this dividing line. So there are a few statutes about tax and public finance. Once you get to the executive branch, regulations are more common, but a lot of it, especially at the city level, is all through informal policy. So this is just to give some concrete, solid empirical illustrations of what I mean by governments don't care to use formal legal instruments that have implications for the legal system. They simply use informal policy documents. So this parliaments play a merely symbolic role, not because they lack independence from the executive branch. No majority party controlled parliament has such independence, but because the executive branch faces little cost from not advancing legislation. So that's why courts are, legislatures are superfluous. Now let me explain with equally simple reasoning why courts don't matter. So China has a civil law judiciary like Brazil. Courts do not set precedents in resolving disputes. Courts apply the law, they do not make the law. Now, if the legislative and the executive branches do not make law, there simply is no law for courts to apply. Right? So that's a very simple story. How can you have a large judiciary that does nothing? Well, this is the simple way it happens. There's no law to apply. Okay. And so in most areas of governance, including tax, courts hold little relevance. Here, this is something that's more esoteric. It's very close to what Louise does, but to the rest of you, maybe it's not familiar. Or if there's any country in the world where commoners are familiar with this topic, it will be Brazil. Okay, this is about tax litigation. So you are surrounded by so much tax litigation that even if you're not a tax lawyer, you probably know about it. But if you look at China, this is the quantity of tax litigation in China in the entire country. Okay. The height was in the early 2000s. It was about 2,000 cases. And it dropped to about 300 or 400 in the mid 2000s. It's come back a little bit. So this goes up to 2013. Right now, it's just hovering around 1,000. So, so I have an article trying to explain why this happens. A basic explanation is that in tax collection, neither the government nor citizens follow rules. Therefore, they don't go to court when they have a disagreement. So that, I have to say, I have to admit, that's a very unconventional picture, but I'm pretty confident that it's true if you look at these statistics. And so, but it's so far away from the conventional picture. What I do in the book is not to argue this. What I say is, isn't it incredible that a state can implement so much policy, govern a modern economy without law? How do you secure social coordination? What the book does is to answer that question. What is that substitute for law? Okay. And so the basic answer is that there's a state machinery for public enforcement of crude policy objectives, and it's successful in some ways and less successful in the others. So this is an elaborate story. It's what the book is about. And so instead of going into the details, maybe let me save that for Q&A if we have time. But let me give you a few takeaways from the book that shows why does it matter that a certain area of governance happens through a law or not. So first of all, through this way of using a state machinery that relies very little on law, China is able to relatively successfully raise revenue while supporting economic growth. That probably is the most central benchmark of the success of a tax system. Second, it has very good taxpayer services. If you want to provide taxpayer services, you actually don't need law. Okay, you can help them in all kinds of ways. So those are two examples. Two things that really depend on law to function. One is actually information. So in order for government to get good information from taxpayers through tax returns, taxpayers need to follow the law in filling out the tax return. Okay. When no one follows the rules, the tax returns are useless. And so the government has very little information because the legal norm of truthful reporting is not enforced. And so this has been the problem in Chinese taxation. Chinese tax administrators are highly aware of it. They hope that the long-term solution is just a lot of government surveillance. The increased use of technology will basically obviate the need for truthful reporting on the part of taxpayers. And then finally, in the United States and Canada, we talk a lot about efficiency in taxation. You want people to behave, react in precise ways to tax rules. But when people don't follow the rules, they're not going to achieve that efficiency. And so tax policy in China is not efficient in the normal way we think about them. And when governments try to implement tax policy to achieve economic objectives, their main lever is to raise or lower the overall level of taxes, which would look very crude to people in Canada or in the US. I don't know, perhaps in Brazil, but that's what China does. Okay, so I'm gonna rush through this last part. Kyle, is it okay if I have 5 more minutes? Okay, great, thank you. So I wanted us to take a step back. So it shouldn't be no secret, but we shouldn't forget that China was a very poor country until very recently. And so I graphed the GDP per capita on this graph in purchasing power parity terms. And that was because if I did it in nominal terms, the top green line is Brazil, and there was a big drop, far bigger drop than you observed here in the early 2010s. So I assume that has to do with currency and so on. But you see that back in as recently as 1997, the GDP per capita of China was at the level of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding high-income countries like South Africa. It's very poor, okay? And the pink line here is Peru, and so Peru is a relatively affluent country in South America, but less affluent than Brazil. And so China caught up with Peru only in 2014, okay? And so, and it seemed to have caught up with Brazil around 2018. So China was a very poor country until very recently. It still is not a rich country, right? And so when China introduced its modern tax system in 1994, it anticipated substantially transplanting Western-style tax practices. How do we move to a market economy and prosper economically? We need taxation, and how do we tax? The plan was to transplant Western-style tax practices. And so in 1993, the State Council described the new approach to the administration. There's focus on self-assessment through filing tax returns, tax professions would assist tax lawyers with compliance. There will be strong audit capacity to enforce the law, and there will be legislation and adjudication to base taxation on legal norms. That was solidly the plan of the government coming from the State Council itself. Okay. This plan was actually based on advice from international organizations like the IMF. And so what it's one can understand the recommendations of these international organizations as recognizing something fundamental, which is that modern taxation is actually based on self-assessment. Self-assessment is not the same as voluntary compliance, because voluntary compliance conveys you're doing something out of your moral incentives, whereas self-assessment is a legal obligation that is enforced. Self-assessment implies a background legal system. And that legal system is not parliaments, not courts, but the basic legal ordering of society. To self-assess, you need to know what the rules are. And so the filing of tax returns is a paradigm of subjecting human conduct to the governance. And then, of course, what audits do is to enforce this obligation of accurate self-assessment. And therefore, audits, the main technique of tax enforcement in modern tax systems, is to actually assume the background legal system. This is what China planned to adopt in 1994. What my book explains is that the Chinese government quickly realized that this kind of Western-style taxation based on legal ordering is neither consistent with China's top-down but decentralized political structure, nor necessary for tax collection. There's something else you can do to collect tax. And so this alternative system, which is native to China, is based on what I call atomistic coercion in the book, and based on performance evaluations of civil servants, offering pecuniary incentives to tax collectors. This was consolidated as early as 2005. And so basically after 2005, taxation and law have been decoupled in an unprecedented way at a massive scale. And so Chinese tax system is the largest system in the world that illustrate a method of taxation that you basically don't really see elsewhere in a comprehensive fashion. So I'm going to skip some figures from the book about how the system actually works. It's an intricate story. This is my last slide. Does it matter that China's tax system and public finance largely operates without legal ordering, without a significant role of legal institutions? And so coming from places where I'm at, Canada, the US, when you say the system lacks the rule of law, that is categorically damning. That's a bad thing. That becomes almost an irredeemable quality. However, let's think about it. Is the Chinese tax system unjust? Does it support substantial redistribution? And does it hurt economic growth? It turns out that tax systems are usually evaluated by these criteria. If a tax system raises revenue and supports redistribution to the poor, while avoids hampering economic growth, could it be accepted as legitimate, even in the absence of the rule of law? So I showed you some pictures of Xi Jinping doing large tax cuts. And so there's question about whether redistribution can still happen. But you also saw periods of rapid revenue growth, successful revenue raising, and that was all done without the rule of law. Okay. It turns out that this apparatus, without the rule of law, is also operating now to respond to COVID-19 and to eradicate absolute poverty in China. Those are two major policy achievements in China in the year 2020. And at least for now, China has been more effective in achieving these policy goals than we could have expected. And so this is a basic intellectual challenge China presents to the world, which is we're so used to condemning a system for lacking of the rule of law. But if a system achieves some basic legitimacy by achieving other policy objectives, this raises the question whether our discomfort about the lack of rule of law should have so much weight. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Professor Cui. It was really a privilege to listen to you and to see how China always challenged our established assumptions here in the West about rule of law or certainty, especially in the theme in the subject that is tax law, that here in Brazil is always a matter of heated discussions on the complexity, litigation, or uncertainty. In the next step of this presentation, I would like to invite Professor Shuedi to discuss about the topic. Professor Shuedi, you have our attention.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Wei, for your fantastic presentation, showing us a bit of China. I'm always curious to understand China as a political system and as a tax system. And you understand that when we talk about taxes, of course, my first aim is to try to compare tax systems. And China and Brazil seem to have so much in common when you talk about, for instance, fiscal federalism, which we have not discussed here, how the system works with taxes, which local taxes, how you work with consumption taxes and local consumption taxes. And of course, when you have a huge market, as you have in China, and local taxes, how to work with this. I would be curious, but I saw this was not, let's say, the focus of your presentation. Also, it's always interesting to discuss, to understand the role of tax incentives, because you showed the tax burden as a whole, but it was not clear there who is paying the taxes and who is not paying the taxes. I mean, I do not believe that that this is a flat taxation. I understand that some branches or some areas have some tax incentives depending on regions or sectors and so on. So a bit of this kind of policy could be understood also. Another issue, which I think that China and Brazil have in common, is the role of taxation at source. So when you see the challenges of this digital economy and so on, Brazil and China say, well, we know this, but there is a very easy way to catch these people, which is the taxation at source. And I think that Brazil and China have been giving a hand to each other and saying, that's our way, let's continue on this. So this is also an area of taxation in which we have much in common. But now when you go more on your presentation, the fact is that the total taxation does not show the quality of a tax system. So you can know how much you're collecting, but not whom you are collecting from. And usually when we talk about tax law, we want also to know who is paying this and how this is being distributed. I'm telling you this way, because presently, we are in Brazil, we have our finance minister wanting to recreate a tax on financial transactions. A low tax in every financial transaction. It means that if you send some money give money to your wife for her to go to the supermarket, and so you simply make a transfer from your bank to your wife, which means you're in the same family, there would be a taxation on this. It means it has nothing to do with ability to pay and so on, but it's very effective. It would collect a lot of money. So this would be an effective in the sense of collecting, but clearly not a good tax system if you don't consider who is paying, why, is being paid. So the reasons why is being paid should also be discussed. You talked about the question of truthful reporting, and which means that if the reporting is not truthful, many are not paying presently taxes, so some must be paying for the others, which was also a problem we face here with the assessment. We said, well, but self-assessment requires knowledge of law, which you said, well, there is some information is the point. But then this brings me to the very first question for you. You talked about the role of your IDPs. And from what I understood in IDPs, this is not exactly something transparent on the way it is made. And I mean, also, and this perhaps you could explain to us about its flexibility also. I mean, you are in a country of more than 1 billion people. How can you, if you work with IDPs, no publicity, how can you be sure of how much tax you must pay? And especially when you tell me that there are pecuniary incentives to collectors, this looks like an explosive moisture, because of collectors may say, wow, you don't know exactly the law, how it is, but here's how I read the law, you should pay more or less. And they have some incentives on this. So it's very, at least, of course, you can say Chinese mentality is different from Brazilian mentality. And certainly I'm thinking as a Brazilian, when I say, I couldn't live with the fact that tax collectors would have pecuniary incentives for what they collect from me, because especially if I'm not aware of what is the law, because the law is not public. The law is what they say is the law. So it means it looks very explosive. So I'd like to understand, perhaps you could explain a bit more of the mentality, and whether I'm seeing some ghosts when I see that. I mean, when you have the old rule of law, something public, you could at least discuss. Then you say, in a year, you have 400 cases, 400 tax cases. My firm has 400 tax cases a month, my firm. So I mean, it's uncomparable, the numbers you have there. And of course, you cannot have a tax case if you don't know what the law is. So it's very unsecure in this sense. Yeah. So is there not a risk that there is a huge inequality of who is paying and who is not paying taxes? I mean, how can you guarantee a minimum of fairness? And of course, when I talk about fairness, you spoke so much about efficiency, but I believe that also efficiency can be granted when you know at ex ante how much tax you're going to pay, because you plan your business knowing your taxation. But once you don't know what is the tax, I don't know whether maybe I understood wrong, but I understood that the IDP is something which is not transparent, which is something not public, which, as you said, can change the whole time. So it's amazing that you can do business in such an environment. So if I would ask you first to discuss this position of the medium businessman in such an environment, with tax collectors having incentive to collect as much as they can. They are the only ones who know what the law is or is said to be, because of course the law is what they say. The law is what they claim to be, and US taxpayers cannot control it. So I think that's quite scary. Please understand where I'm talking about from a Brazilian mentality. And this is interesting, the dialogue, to understand different mentalities and how this work. Now, going to your presentation, the very first idea, which I found interesting, was the superfluity of legislatures. You mentioned there's the parliamentary system, then you bring the argument that the same as several modern countries or democracies, you have legislative and executive branches which work together. And this is something which, for you to know, we in Brazil, different from the majority controlled democracies, as you mentioned, we do not have a parliamentarism.
Yeah.
So in our case, we have a president who is directly elected by people in the system, one man, one vote, while the Congress has not the same system. For instance, every state has 3 senators, irrespective of whether this is a big state or a small state. So you already see that in the Senate, it is not true that you have one man, one vote, in the sense of representation. When you go to the other house, you have the same idea, because you have a minimum of deputies, a maximum of deputies. As a result, our Congress is not based on a system one man, one vote. For this reason, you can say that although they are elected in the same date, president and, which is executive, and Congress do not represent the same forces. So you need lots of compromises. For instance, you have an instrument in Brazil, which is a provisional measure, which was supposed to be a way in which the executive would legislate. And within 60 days, Congress would rectify what the president has done. In tax matters, I've made a research on this. I can tell you that more than 80% of these provisional measures, which are adopted by the president, are either rejected or substantially changed by the legislative. So for us, the rule of law is a guarantee that two different forces have somehow found a compromise. So for us, the legality principle is even stronger than in what you call majority controlled democracies. Because you're right, in Europe, for instance, executive and legislative, they are speaking the same language, and we do not have this here. So please understand that we have, for us, the law is a very important, it's the statute, I mean now, is a very important instrument. We want the statute because that's where we have this balance of the two forces I just mentioned to you. Well, but now going to your argument and this informal policy documents, which for me was, these IPDs, for me, very interesting. You mentioned this, that in summary, I understand that the Chinese tax system, and we saw in the numbers, in the graphics, is controlled by IPDs. Now comes the question. China has also international relationship, has international investors. And these international investors need or should need some legal certainty. How can you offer legal certainty to an investor with IPD? My question would go further to ask you, what is the role of tax treaties in China? Brazil has a tax treaty with China in which, let's say, at least some parameters, some minimum parameters are granted there. Can I bring Chinese government to Chinese courts in case of breaching a tax treaty? Can I say, sorry, this is against the tax treaty? So do tax treaties prevail over your informal policy documents, or is the opposite? Another question I would make to you, irrespective of tax treaties, there are some conventions, or which are not tax conventions, which China signed in. For instance, I'm talking about WTO. And through WTO, there are some limits on subsidies. My question is, again, could you bring before a Chinese court, Chinese government saying this subsidy, which is being granted here, is against WTO? Or if you allow me to enforce more, I don't know whether this would be possible. But there are some treaties on human rights. And could you say that IPDs do not respect some human right? I'm talking about property, for instance. Could you say, hey, hello, there are some limits. I'm claiming now human rights because I'm thinking on France, because France until about 10, 15 years ago, you could never bring a tax law before courts because there was the idea of supremacy of the law in this case, and you could not bring this from a constitutional perspective. But the French began to bring the cases, tax cases, not claiming the constitution, but rather, in their case, the European Convention on Human Rights. So you have some interesting French cases in which you see that taxation have to do also with human rights. Could there be a space for this? You see, I'm trying to expand these 500 cases. Maybe since I'm a lawyer and know I practice as a lawyer, I always want to know whether there is a possibility of more discussions or not. Another question. So talking about this superfluity of courts, I would go further. Despite not having statutes, are there principles or let's say super rules which a taxpayer could always claim? Imagine, for instance, that there would be a tax on the use of beard, as you had in Russia in the beginning of the 20th century. I don't see it. Of course, I would hate such a tax. You can imagine why. But I mean, using a beard has nothing to do with ability to pay. At least presently, I imagine that in China, a person with beard is not richer or not better than a person without a beard. So my question is, can you claim, for instance, ability to pay as a principle to say this taxation may not happen? Are there limits for a taxation which are not formal now? I'm talking about substantial limits of taxation, ability to pay, confiscatory taxes, these kind of issues. Is there a possibility for you to bring such a situation before a court? And especially the question of the principle of equality. Can I say my neighbor is having a different treatment and there is no reason for this discrimination? Can I bring a case before Chinese courts? You said they have a minimum role because there is no statute. But I'm asking, at least equality could be a reason for me to say, why am I paying this tax and my neighbor is not? There's a discrimination here or not? This would be, allow me just to make questions because, of course, your presentation is so nice that you begin to discuss here. And maybe the last issue which I want to discuss is this issue, this distinction between formal legitimacy, which is democracy, elections, rule of law, etc., and substantial legitimacy, which is a government, as you say, that successfully meets social needs. Formal legitimacy is ex ante, is negative. A government is formally legitimate because it was brought to power by elections and because it respects the rule of law. Substantial legitimacy is a posteriori. It is positive. A government is substantially legitimate because it effectively improves social standards, as you claim. Your slide analyzes the Chinese tax system in terms of substantial legitimacy. The system collects tax revenue, reduces social inequality, and does not hamper economic growth, despite the absence of rule of law. My question is, how to ensure legitimacy from a substantial perspective. The assessment of a good or bad quality of a government is highly complex and controversial. Also, the criteria for such an assessment are not clear, especially if you consider the impossibility to meet all social claims equally and harmonically. For instance, is the reduction of social disparities more important than economic growth? Is the fight against illiteracy more important than public health concerns? I'm not talking about choices, which, how can you control these choices if you do not have some formal democracy? The very assessment of the quality of a government, that is to say, the assessment of substantial legitimacy of government, requires reliable data. And such data need to be interpreted. To conclude that a system, as you say, promotes redistribution or does not hamper economic growth requires data interpretation, which is a very hard task under a non-transparent regime. In summary, it is true that a substantially oriented legitimacy can be theoretically conceived. However, the difficulties and complexities involving its assessment in practice lead one to conclude that formal legitimacy will always be relevant. Even though elections and rule of law grant little to citizens in terms of social progress, which I agree, they ensure a basic level of governmental legitimacy, the public choices, what is to expect, what is to evaluate, assuming, and this must be assumed, that you cannot cover all the claims equally. To evaluate what a government does in order to conclude on its legitimacy or not is too complex. And I believe that formal legitimacy would be a tool at least to explain why this choice was made, why this is relevant and not the other. Otherwise, they'll say, well, substantially, I have achieved some goals. Yes, but who chose these goals? Why are these goals more relevant than the other goals? So I would answer to you, Wei, if you allow me. Yes, it matters that China's tax system operates without the rule of law. These are my comments to you. Thank you very much, Wei.
Thank you so much, Luis.
Professor Cui, feel free to answer the questions.
Sure. So Luis, not only did you raise many very good questions, I see you, I hear you, as probably others also hear you, as mounting a passionate defense of many values associated with the rule of law and with democracy. And of course, these are values that we cherish in Canada, in many other parts of the world. So I'll try to make my answer brief. So first, a clarificatory question about the last point you make, which is I'm not claiming in my last slide that I believe that the Chinese government has substantive legitimacy. As a social scientist, I can say that if it achieves certain social outcomes, it's likely to command legitimacy from the Chinese people. And so purely looking at what the Chinese people do and what they say, they're going to be finding this government legitimate. Okay. And in terms of whether these outcomes are measurable, I think they can be measured. And so how much tax you're collecting, how much economic growth you're producing, how much redistribution you're doing, you can all do that through scholarship. But I agree with you that it's actually difficult to come to terms with this idea that without the rule of law at all, right, and very thorough, you can gain a sense of legitimacy. So to answer that, let me answer you a very early question. And so you asked many questions, but let me just put one big, make it very concrete. how do I go about living in China, trying to do business, earn income, if I have no law around me, right? That's the central question you ask. And that is the question that my book tries to answer. The answer is actually not that difficult, okay? And so you really can think about that in concrete ways. So let me just say that I made a presentation about this at our own law school, and uh, one colleague of mine from China who didn't know much about my work immediately spoke and said, everything Wei said is true, meaning that she hasn't thought about it and no one tried to describe this way of living as rule of law without rule of law before, but it sounds exactly, that's how she lives, all right? And so basically the answer, I can try to give a concise answer. If you're average business, what the book describes is that you are in touch with a small group of tax collectors, and they're in charge of collecting tax revenue from you, okay? And so that's true for all businesses in China. And so in this case, you may not engage in truthful reporting. You may lie on your tax returns, but the point is that what's on the tax returns doesn't really matter, because the tax administrator has certain expectations about how much you should be paying. He knows something about your business and he has certain expectations. In this realm, how hard is it for you to know what your tax administrator's expectation is? It's actually not that hard when you're in regular contact for a long period of time. You can ask all the time. For one, tax administrators are always accessible. So in this mode of regular contact, actually even the informal policy documents issued by higher ups, by officials in Beijing, doesn't really matter. You don't even need to know the IPDs, let alone the statutes and regulations. You just need to know what your tax administrator expects of you. And that actually brings substantial certainty, because you observe these individuals, you regularly interact with them. And so what can happen, maybe he's facing a higher revenue target from above than expected. He's going to negotiate with you. And that happens, that that's going to happen. As long as the overall tax intake, and so from the government side, it doesn't matter if you lie in your tax returns, through this kind of regular contact, a certain amount of revenue will be collected. And you also know that he's not going to ask for an outrageous amount of revenue, because how can he do that, right? He can't get that out of you. And so I believe there's substantial certainty in personal interaction, and especially if you're a large company, hiring a lot of tax lawyers and tax accountants, the government is outmanned always, all right? And so how many tax collectors can stand up to a team of tax professionals telling them that they're doing the wrong thing, right? And so that's for businesses. For individuals, there's just a lot of low taxation of and non-compliance, and the government's lack of enforcement of rules allows people to be ignorant of the rules, and people are happy living like that. And so you will find many Chinese individuals coming to places like Canada, the United States, finding out that you actually have to declare all these personal things on your tax returns, and they've never had to assemble that information before. And the idea is that you're going to tell somebody that this is the amount of income you have and pay tax on it is pretty shocking. Yeah. So it's possible to live that way. All my friends, colleagues in China, live that way. And so it's very interesting for me, it's interesting exercise to understand that they do live in this way and highlight how different that is from what people are used to elsewhere in the world. And finally, I agree, China may be unique in a lot of respects. I would agree with that. Now, certain things, like when I say it has a parliamentary system, it's not unique in that way. It has clear, well-known differences from presidential systems like Brazil and the United States. But it could be unique in certain ways. We're just talking about China, right? The United States is a very unique country. But we try to learn so much about it, right? And those of us who are US trained start out our careers thinking that the US way of doing things is the way of doing things, even though it's quite an international outlier in so many respects. And China may be unique for the same reason, but it's important to understand it.
Wait, please, sorry, I want to know about the issue of equality. Can I bring a case before court saying that there is a discrimination against me because my tax inspector is acting in a way which is not similar to what other tax inspectors are doing? So I have competition issues and so on within my market. I mean, how can I control my tax inspector?
Yeah. So I think by implication, I assume that you can do that in Brazil. Yeah, you can't do that anywhere. You can't do that in Canada or the United States. That's pretty special about Brazil. Yeah, no, you can't do it in China, right?
So you can bring a case arguing the principle of equality, even there is no rule of law, but equality. You can at least say discrimination.
No, there's no such legal principle that's actionable.
I know.
It's not justiciable by the courts. No.
So that means if I have the bad luck that my inspector doesn't like me,
no,
I'll pay more taxes, and it's life.
If you comply with the law, you could go to court, right? Most of the time, you're better off not complying with the law. In that case, you don't go to court.
We had in the past a regime which was authoritarian enough for the president by that time to have a saying. He said, "For my friends, I give everything. For my enemies, I give the law." Okay.
Yeah, no, that's not irrelevant. That's somewhat relevant to, as you say, all authoritarian regimes. Yes.
And the issue of treaties, at least treaties could be brought before court. Are treaties tool of legal certainty in this environment?
Yeah.
Once China signed a treaty,
yeah. So,
can you say, sorry, you may not tax this?
Yeah, I had written a lot about this when I was in China. There's substantial inconsistency between treaty law, what the treaty law says, and actual practice. And so from that, my sense is that no government really is very serious about treaties. And so non-enforcement of treaties, we think about treaties as a contract between countries, but the default mode is non-enforcement. Not just in China, right? I mean, if China violates treaties, but the contractual state on the other side doesn't do anything, right?
Because our government does infringe treaties, but we can bring the case before court. So at least we have the hope that courts will say, "Oh, sorry, this government, you may not do this because there's a treaty." We can bring a treaty before court.
And I read some of your writing before on this. My sense is that, Brazil's position towards treaties raises a lot of controversy, right?
Always when people say this, I say Brazilian government's position before treaty raises problems.
Yes.
But Brazil is much more than its government because it has a judiciary.
Okay.
So when you see the decisions of courts, then you say, "Well, this is different."
Yeah, got it.
So thank you, Professor Cui. Thank you, Professor Schueri. And for the questions and for the stimulus about what we call the clash of civilization or legal cultures. It's an interesting feature of the Cella. It always makes us here in the West very very interested in this kind of things, how things happen different in the East. And now we would like to invite Professor Carlos Portugal Gouveia, who is the coordinator, to make some additional comments before we open into questions. And Professor Gouveia, feel free to make some questions as well.
Thank you, Kyle. I hope you guys can hear me well. Well, first, I would like to thank Professor Wei so much for your presentation. We're looking forward to have your book available here in Brazil. It was a wonderful presentation, and would also like to thank Professor Schwery for his comments. I think the debate between you two is like the reason why we started Sella a few years ago. I can see how Kayo is happy, and that makes me happy too. I think all of our students who are watching it just had a wonderful example of what legal debate should be at an extremely high level of excellence. So thank you both very, very much. And Professor Wei, I think your presentation brought to Sella the exact same feeling that I had about 20 years ago when I took my first course on Chinese law, and of course, indoctrinated very much on traditional Western legal thought. I had the same impression that I had during your presentation, like, what is this, like a legal system from Mars, or it's so far away from our reality, but also it invites and it should invite a very profound reflection about what we understand, how we understand that a legal system should be. And I remember that the entire course at the time was around, is there rule of law in China? There could be rule of law in China. And at that time, there was a strong belief in the US that there could be, and it was very much focused on corporate law. That is my specialty. And people really thought, there should be rule of law in China, because otherwise there's going to be corruption and the system is going to collapse and everything's going to go to dust without the rule of law. And I remember at the time, I remember learning much more from the Chinese students who were at the class than from the professors, because the professors were so dominated by this idea and so little open to really, engaging and really deeply understanding how the Chinese legal system works. And I remember from one of the students saying, yeah, well, of course there is, rule of law. There is rule of law in China since the imperial times. It's the same rule of law. It's different, but there is the rule of law. But the difference is that is much more focused on administrative law than judicial, the operation of the judicial system as we are used to. So with time, I came to understand that there is a strange way of like a legal certainty. People don't feel that they don't know what's going to happen to them, or they don't really know what the law is. It's kind of, they know by repetition, by what happens to their neighbors, by what happens to people on the streets. It's a different way of understanding how the law works, but not so unique in human history. And actually, there is a strong connection between this kind of hierarchical legal system and the imperial legal system in China, or the legal system in other empires, even some that came after, for example, the Roman Empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, in which for a long time administrative law was the mainstay of their legal system. So for me, from your description, it raised the issue that Chinese law is very focused on results. It's extremely focused on results. So it seems that the entire tax system is monitored in order to achieve certain goals, and it's all focused on achieving those goals. And if it's reducing the tax burden on society, they will reduce tax burden. And if it's to increase, they will increase. But the main purpose of the legal system is to achieve those goals. So it's totally pragmatic, and there is an option between this pragmatism and the focus on proceduralism. So that's why at a certain point, our concern with traditional concepts of the rule of law get kind of missed in the way. And what strikes me very much is sometimes the difference between this alternative and I think Brazil, that is kind of extreme position on the other side, very strong litigation, very proceduralist. The legal system is constructed in a way in which you have so many layers. You have, Professor Schwery probably can explain in more detail, because I kind of get lost in how many layers the administrative system has from our in our federal revenue services. And then, you know, when you get to the judicial system, then it's insane. Like some people could say, you might have like a kind of 4 layers, and in each layer you have 300 kinds of, you know, different appeals that you can file. So I would say that administrative proceeding that eventually reach the Supreme Court might take, what, 20, 25 years or something to be resolved. So in a sense, it's an option between the traditional concept of the rule of law and, you know, basically no certainty at all, and an option for, you know, extreme certainty in the sense that, you know, you go to someone and the person will say, you have to pay those taxes, and, you know, that's it, it's over, game over, that's it, you pay, and you have 100% certainty in about, you know, half an hour instead of, you know, maybe 25 years. So it's really like a totally different extreme. And in the middle, I think there are like systems in which it's very expensive to litigate, like in the US, in which you also have limited tax litigation. You know, I remember working in US firms in reorganization proceedings, in which you would have companies that would, you know, have revenues of $50 billion a year and no tax litigation at all. Like here in Brazil, I think it's just impossible for a large company not to have tax litigation, especially if it's going through a reorganization process. It will even increase its tax litigation in the years prior to filing for reorganization. So what I would like to ask you is if this view is correct, that there is an option for result, for a certainty that is related to having a response very quickly in the Chinese legal system. So you have an option for an administrative mechanism. And also, following some of the questions from Professor Schwery, I would like to know if you understand that there are, like, of course, when we think about an authoritarian regime, we think about, you know, eventually the use of force in a very blunt way against the individuals, limiting their individual rights. But for the system to work, you probably should have other kind of less extreme kind of punishments if people just don't follow those administrative commandments. So I would like to understand if you, in your research, you identified some of those kind of less aggressive kind of penalties. Like, for example, if you're a member of the Communist Party and then you get caught like cheating on your taxes, I would say that eventually you're not going to jail eventually, but, you know, somehow you're gonna lose a lot of prestige. You're gonna lose many opportunities that you might have. So I would like to understand that if there are like other kind of reputational kind of micro punishments that also make part of that system. And again, thank you both very, very much.
Sure, I can try to briefly answer just a couple of questions coming from you, Professor, and so that so these are very good questions. I think I want to clarify a couple of things. I wonder if any of you would say that, the law is less certain in the United States than in Brazil. Would any of you say that? Right. And so there's certainly a lot less tax litigation in the US, right? And in Canada, there's even less, right? In Canada, the annual litigation volume is less than 2,000. And so even on a per capita basis, it's lower in the US, which has about 30,000 cases a year. Yeah. And so litigation does not reflect the certainty of the law at all. I think, Brazil is clearly an international outlier. It may be how the law is drafted. It also has to do with the fact that Brazil just has a very low number of tax administrators on a per capita basis. And so a lot of problems in Canada are dealt with through routine interactions with the CRA. And so you can resolve disputes. If people can resolve their disputes, they don't want to go to court, right? And so that brings the question of what do we take as the benchmark? I think the answer is that it's not clear. Countries differ very widely when you look at particular phenomena like litigation or quantity of tax litigation. So we have to take a step back, so I would say that there's very little legal certainty in China, that's for sure. And fundamentally, forget about courts, forget about parliaments. Law is about the governance of conduct by rules. People know what to expect ahead of time, and that's the virtue of law. It allows very complex social coordination. So social coordination without the help of law seems like something that's going to be much harder to do. Right? And so what's amazing is for China to get by in many areas, going without this tool of social coordination. And that's something that we need to better understand. I think finally, I want to say that, of course, as academics, when we talk about law, we need to be very precise about what we're talking about. And so that's why I say, at the level of abstraction, let's define what the rule of law is, whether it's parliaments or courts, or whether it's a basic pattern of conduct. There are lots of debates about how China had a traditional rule of law, but the answer is very obvious. If you look at imperial China, the areas of law are very narrow. And so law is used to govern very few areas of conduct. And so it's not really relevant for us to think about the rule of law in the modern economy. And so the kind of law that China had in the imperial times would not be serviceable compared to the kind of commercial law that developed in Europe, let's say by the 16th or 17th century. And so when we talk about whether there was a legal tradition, there was a legal tradition. It just applied to a few areas. And then finally, just to emphasize again, it's not so much that law is oriented to practical outcomes in China. It's that people can manage without law altogether. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cui. Also, thank you so much, Professor Gouveia, for the questions. And now we would like to open for questions of the students or for questions of people who are in the YouTube. So please feel free to raise your hands physically or through the reactions feature of the Zoom. if any one of you want to make some questions to Professor Cui. João Aro, please.
Okay, so Professor, if first of all, I would really like to thank the presentation and the discussion we've had today. Professor Wei, it was very informative, a very complete framework of how the tax system works in China. Also, Professor Shuedi and Professor Carlos with the very pertinent comments, which really, I think, went deeper into this topic that we are studying and discussing today. And I have a couple of questions, actually. The first question is more directed to Professor Wei, which is that you mentioned, Professor, that the truthful reporting is a very important part of the Chinese tax system. And I would like to question how much the specifics of the economy of China support this truthful reporting. So, for example, we have news of the central bank, the People's Bank of China, experimenting with a proprietary cryptocurrency. And also we have apps, smartphone apps like WeChat, which have digital wallets, which are a lot easier to track and to keep track of what people are spending and what they are receiving. And how much does this aspect of the Chinese economy contribute to the truthful reporting that is so important in the tax system?
Let me answer that quickly. Just to clarify, truthful reporting, which I associate with the idea of a self-assessment in tax system, is central to modern tax systems until China came along. China is a modern tax system that claims to be collecting the same taxes as other countries are collecting without truthful reporting, without self-assessment. And so self-assessment and truthful reporting depends on people following legal norms. That's not what you observe in China. That's the biggest difference between China and other tax systems. No truthful reporting. The truthful report norms of, a lot of businesses report truthfully. It's just that the norm of truthful reporting are not enforced. And that comes to a bit of a question to what Professor Collins raised. If you lie on your tax return, do you get punished? There's little penalty, right? The most important thing is that you pay the tax desired of you. You're not punished for lying. So the penalty rate is very low. The amount of actual coercion against taxpayers is quite limited. And on the other side, taxpayer service is very good. By the standards of a middle income country. I hope that's relevant to your question.
Oh, yes, that cleared up a lot of questions, but let me rephrase this question. How much is it possible for the government and the tax offices to assess if and whether people are leaving some taxes out of the reporting with the technology that we have in China, and especially the mobile apps, and even you have systems like the social scoring, which place a let's call it a social pressure on people to not disobey the laws and be seen as against the government or going against the interests of the nation. How much does the technology play a part in, let's say, verifying whether people are or not evading their taxes?
Well, the answer is the following. That's a good question. I addressed it in the book. Think about two different systems. One is based on self-assessment and truthful reporting. That's a system that can be made strong by government audits, right? But the government's audits only says we all believe in self-assessment and truthful reporting, and we're going to enforce that norm. We're trying to catch people who do not follow that norm. All right. But that system does not depend on surveillance. Another system where taxpayers do not follow rules, they do not have to truthfully report. So the government actually needs to surveil the population more. There has to be closer monitoring of what people do, right? And so, so basically, because of that, the Chinese government, like many other governments, are interested in increasing their surveillance capacity. Okay, and so as long as the government can increase surveillance capacity, all kinds of misconduct can happen. And so, if you ask about modern tax systems without surveillance power, do Bitcoin and other modes of transaction pose a serious threat to government revenue? I think every government would say yes, right? And you can say that China is ahead of the game because they are so dependent on surveillance that they are very motivated to invest as early as possible in new techniques of surveillance.
Great, thank you, Professor. And also the follow-up question, which is in another topic, not really very related to the first one, is also for Professor Shueri, if he prefers to interject. It's about how we perform tax reforms in our systems. So, for example, we have there's this debate on the property tax on residences on China, and also we have at this moment a very, let's say, precarious situation with Evergrande and the housing market in general in China. And in Brazil, we have also a tax proposal which has been very criticized in the last few weeks or months, which brings a few changes to the personal income tax, and also changes a lot of little things in the system, like removing the tax exemption on dividends from real estate investment trusts, or the equivalent of real estate investment trusts in Brazil. And my question is, how do we design a reform for taxation which brings social stabilization and avoids creating new problems in the economy? And how should we approach creating these changes to the system without creating big disruptions?
Let me say for what we are having in Brazil, then we can say, well, we are seeing what we should not do. Because presently we are having a project to change the corporate income tax, of course, we connect both of them, on a very fast way, on a fixed idea of our Minister of Finance, who has not discussed with the society what was needed. And it's interesting enough that we have several problems in the corporate taxation, which are not targeted, but there are issues which nobody was complaining about and which he wants to change. In democracies, what we would expect would be a huge discussion in society. Just compare what you're having in the field of our consumption tax, in which we have been discussing for more than 3 years to try to reach a consensus, which of course will not be perfect, but at least people know what are the effects of what is being done. If you compare, because just for you to say, we are saying that we have a democracy and so on, and of course we're comparing mentality. But the reform that has just been mentioned by João, it is amazing. I don't know whether you know, Bismarck once said that if people would know how laws and sausages are made, they will not eat sausages and they will not follow the laws. In the case of this project, which João is mentioning, the House voted the project without knowing what they were voting, because the reporter made changes in the bill. In the very last second, he read his report He didn't even distribute it in writing, talking about a tax issue, which is complex, which needs. I think I believe I understand something about taxation. I needed some hours to digest what was in the paper. And the deputies were able to vote immediately without, let's say, because they guessed what was in the project. So the question for when we talk about formal democracy and so on, what was saying, in reality, João gave us a terrible example of what not to do, João. What we should not do is forcing a tax reform without discussing society, without people knowing what they are voting for, what they are approving or not. You really touched a very shaming case we are having in Brazil in this year, a reform which will affect several people and in which our representatives don't even know what they voted for. What you should have would be a discussion. It is not what we are having presently. As I said, at least you have a court to discuss constitutional issues, so some limits you still hope you will have. And of course, we lawyers will bring some cases more to the court. That's all right. Okay, please.
Professor Cui?
I think that answer was for Louise, right? And so I enjoyed hearing that answer. I think there's another hand up from Daniel.
Yeah. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Professor Wei Yu and Professor Shuedi for the most pleasant presentations. Well, I have two questions. The first one is more directly to Professor Wei, but if Professor Shuedi wants to interfere, consider the, I think, drastic difference between Brazil and China regarding tax regulations and everything else. You think China will be open to a bilateral tax treaty concerning by taxations or something like that? Or you think it's not in the table because it's really different systems? And the second one, the difference between the systems, but also how Chinese investors are come to Brazil to buy companies and do business. How do you think a good lawyer here in Brazil have to address this difference to assert a good advocacy for these clients, Chinese clients here in Brazil? How do you think is the best way to cope with the difference and to explain and to really set these investors here in Brazil, considering the Brazilian federal revenue and everything else that is really different from what the Chinese experience is?
Thank you. I'm very struck by this second question of yours, so I want to jump on it. It's a question for all of you. So when Chinese investors come to Brazil and make investments, Chinese investors, when you go anywhere else in the world, the first thing you want to find out is what are the rules, right? Besides who are the important people, but most times, so what are the rules? So what would you tell Chinese investors about Brazil now that you've learned a little bit about how people manage without much law in China? Would you say, oh, here in Brazil, everything is following rules. We're a very law-abiding country, and you need to follow the rules and you resolve your disputes through formal legal procedures? Is that the main advice you would give to Chinese investors?
Thank you, Professor Wei. Professor.
I think the way I would say, well, I don't really know how people can do business in Brazil, how it works, because legally speaking, you're coming to a country in which most probably taxes will be required from you, and you'll have to discuss them. And you'll see that if you don't discuss, you'll be only paying taxes which others are not paying. So you must follow the others in the arguments. there's a hope that court will, in the long term, court will most probably bring you to what you believe would be the correct tax. But you must be prepared for storms. Storms. And unfortunately, you must also be prepared for something which I don't know, we haven't discussed this way. But in Brazil, the cost of compliance is very high. I mean, I always say that I hate paying taxes. I hate paying taxes. I think everybody hates. But there's one thing worse than paying taxes. It's paying for paying taxes. These are compliance costs. The cost of people whom you must hire with the only objective of making sure that you have no penalty in your assessments and so on, because you're trying to comply with law. For you to have an idea, our League of Industries in the state of São Paulo made a calculation, and it concluded that the cost of compliance for the industry in São Paulo is 1.9% of its gross revenues. This is quite a good tax you're paying for paying taxes.
Okay, and so what if we tied this back to our previous discussion? So if people, Chinese business come to Brazil and you say that we have rules that provide us with a lot of certainty. It's just that you have to litigate in court to secure the outcome that rules guarantee you. And you, to follow these rules is very costly. How do we tie that together with this supreme value of certainty in the law?
That's the point. I don't think that Brazil is an example of legal certainty. I think I'm not proud of our Brazilian system. I think that we need to continue on discussing legal certainty as offering this for investors. I believe that considering the size of our economy, we should have much more investments than we do have. I think we are paying the price for our lack of legal certainty. I mean, for an investor to invest in a country like ours, investor will try to look profits enough to cover such kind of costs. So it's not efficient in any way. I think that if you would offer legal certainty, the cost of transaction would be much lower. I'm using Carlos Portugal's language when I talk about the cost of transaction. But certainly, it is. I mean, we need a move in this direction. We are really far away.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Shuedi, Professor Cui. I have a question for Professor Cui. Actually, there are two questions. I hope they are brief because our time is almost over. And the first one is there, since a lot of there's a huge decentralization of tax administration in China, is there among provinces or local governments a competition for better collection of taxes or more lenient collection of taxes, like tax havens inside China, or more business friendly authorities to attract businesses? Or actually the rules are usually top down and the central government usually tries to hinder this kind of efforts to avoid and race to the bottom? The second one is we have some regulatory taxes here in Brazil. It's a question about not somebody that doesn't know any tax in China, but we have some regulatory taxes which purpose is to simulate or to slow down some sector of the economy, such as tax over financial transactions and FX, import and export taxes, or we have a tax. I don't know if it's a good comparison. That's why we do not use this term, but it's like a VAT called tax over industrialized products. They can be used as a tool of public policy to simulate some sectors of the economy. My question is, do this tax exist in China? And are they usually enforced by the federal government, the central government, or the local or provincial level authorities? And are they used, for example, in regards to like crackdown of some uh, bad behavior sectors or companies?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for those questions, Kyle. There is substantial subnational tax competition as well as regulatory competition. This competition usually happens at the city level or the below at the county and district level. Okay, and so competition at the provincial level is less, right? And this is because most economic outcomes, most governance happens at the city level or lower and not at the provincial level. So I say this, it's easy for lawyers to say this, it's well known, but through rigorous econometric work, scholars, including researchers that I've worked with, have established this. Are there regulatory taxes? I guess it depends on what you mean. I remember a lot of taxation doesn't depend on legislation, right? And so if by regulatory taxes, you just mean executive branch order taxes, yes, there's lots of them. And are there taxes similar to the complex tax system in Brazil? I think from what I've read, it's less complex. And so if you look at the types of taxes China has had in the last 30 years, it's about no more than 20, about 17 taxes, and they are fairly stable in kind. And so what I read about Brazil is, taxes change and the names of taxes change because budgetary allocations are different. There's a lot of earmarking and so on. Yeah, there's no such arrangement in China.
Thank you so much, Professor Kui. And since we are already on time, I would like to thank you so much, Professor Kui. We appreciate your amazing presentation. It is mind blowing for all of us. We are used to a totally opposite system, and when we deal with this, how can you have huge economic growth, a lot of investments, without what we understand as legal certainty? It's really mind blowing and something that we should definitely go deep into it. And we look forward to have your book available so that we may study more, because it presents a very big intellectual challenge for all of us, especially here in Brazil.
Kyle, if you allow me, maybe we could make an addendum, let's say an addendum to his book to say that legal certainty and investments to the case of Brazil as a second case in which legal certainty is not relevant for investments.
Yeah.
Thank you for this great discussion. I really enjoyed it. My views are unconventional. I'm glad that we had this discussion. And I would say, last thing I would say is that, the reason to get the book is that it just has a very different view about things than, all the books out there. Yeah. And because China is going to continue to be very important on the world stage.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's our biggest trading partner. So all the Chinese companies that are here, they understand very well the Brazilian tax system, but we understand absolutely nothing about theirs. So it's important for us to learn about them. And this is one of the purpose of CELA also, because the region of the Pacific, especially, it's very relevant for the global economy and specifically for the Brazilian economy as well. And as a consequence for the legal market and the legal scholarship. We thank you also, Professor Shueri, for the
Yes, thank you.
challenging questions that are amazing.
Yeah.
And also Professor Carlos Portugal, also for the questions as well,
Thank
and
you,
for the
Professor
coordination of the
Portugal.
meeting. Thank you so much.
Okay.
The broadcasting can be closed now.